Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy and specifically to talk about a really interesting drone attack. Now, if you've been following the channel, you'll know that Ukraine has been utilizing drones throughout the whole of the war. And in fact, I think this war can be characterized as being the first that has really taken drone warfare to a new level. At the start of the war, Ukraine was using relatively unsophisticated drones, basically the similar sort of thing that you might see one of your neighbours flying over your garden if he's looking to do a bit of spying on what you're up to in the daytime. You could just strap some small explosives to those, fly them a relatively short distance, and maybe cause a minor explosion. However, over the course of the last 3 years, things have become a lot more sophisticated, and Ukraine has successfully hit targets around 1,000 miles from the Ukraine border. And over the last 12 months, Ukraine has specifically targeted infrastructure within Russia. Initially, it was just oil and gas infrastructure, but recently we've also seen some commercial facilities being attacked, power stations, those sort of things, and ports, which are causing major disruption for Russia. So this is a real headache from Russia's point of view because in terms of on the battlefield, Russia has a lot more firepower and is throwing a lot of finance into the war itself. However, Ukraine is causing major problems and damage to Russia's revenues by taking out a lot of these facilities. And it's now been reported that Ukraine has successfully used an undersea drone, so basically a subsurface drone, to hit a submarine that was located in a naval base within Russia. And this naval base, up until recently, was seen as being a safe haven for Russia. Now, there is a video circulating on the internet of this attack, but I don't want to show that because it shows the explosion taking place, and YouTube is very sensitive about those sort of things. Whenever there's an explosion, there's always a risk of a loss of life. Russia hasn't actually declared anything about this, so we don't know whether or not anybody was injured or killed in that attack. But if they were, then YouTube will close down any videos that are showing that footage. So I'm not going to include it here. You can find it yourself if you just type in Russian submarine attack into Google. I'm sure it will come up really quickly. It isn't particularly spectacular anyway because it didn't hit this submarine as it was moving. It wasn't targeting something that was a moving target. It actually was just sitting in the naval base. You can see the top of the submarine when you look at the footage, and then there's suddenly an explosion. Obviously, you don't see the Ukrainian drone because it was under the water. And it's been reported that this is the first ever underwater drone attack that has been successful in the history of any war. So this is once again Ukraine breaking new technology, breaking new ground, and it spells danger for Russia because if they've done this once, then obviously Ukraine can produce many more of these subsea drones. And Russia clearly wasn't expecting this. It didn't have its defense systems in place to be able to stop the drone hitting the submarine. Now, just before we go on to talk about the implications of this, can I ask anybody that hasn't subscribed yet to please hit that subscribe button? It really does help me with the algorithm. And also, I wanted to remind you that I'm currently running a competition to win my beach house. I own a detached house that actually comes with planning permission to replace it with an amazing 4-bedroom, 3-bathroom upside down house. And it's located very close, a stone's throw away from one of the most beautiful beaches in the whole of the UK. So if you want to live the dream of living by the sea, going for fish and chips and a pint of beer and taking a stroll along the promenade without having any mortgage or debt, then please buy a ticket in that competition. But if you're not interested in that sort of lifestyle, or you just don't want a property in the UK, then I'm also offering an alternative of £250,000 in cash, which obviously can be converted into any currency that you like. So if we're talking about US dollars, that's around about 350,000 US dollars. That's quite a lot of money. So if you're interested in supporting me and the channel, then please buy a ticket in this competition. The price is just £5 each, and good luck. So what are the implications of this submarine attack for both Russia and Ukraine? Well, I think from Russia's point of view, it raises some serious concerns because when you're talking about being hit in one of your naval bases that's located within Russia, clearly that means that nowhere is safe. And obviously Russia didn't have any visibility of this attack coming. Up until now, all of the sea attacks have been above water. So basically, you've got an unmanned vessel that's moving its way, usually very fast through the water. And Ukraine has been successful in utilizing this technology to hit a variety of different Russian ships. Recently, I reported the fact that Russian tankers are now being targeted. These are the Shadow Fleet, Dark Fleet, Grey Fleet, whatever you want to call it. Ukraine is now starting to hit those vessels, and that's causing issues not just for Russia, but also the countries that are operating those vessels. I recently reported that Senegal has come out and said that it will no longer transport any Russian oil because one of its vessels was targeted. So it's definitely having a real life impact already. But the fact that Ukraine has now developed this subsea technology, this drone was called a subsea baby. That's what it's been labeled. We don't actually have any footage or any pictures of it at the moment. So Ukraine is keeping it very tightly under wraps as to how it's actually managed to achieve this. But it does raise alarm bells for Russia because it means that any of its ships are now vulnerable to these sorts of attacks, not just the military vessels, but also its commercial fleet. So the gloves are off in terms of the war itself. And I think that's going to cause concern amongst commercial fleets, that captains of these ships will be worried that they could be targeted at any time. So it doesn't just mean that Ukraine is taking the war to Russia. It means that Ukraine is taking the war to Russia across the commercial fleet as well. So not just military vessels. So I think that's a major concern. Now, in terms of the submarine that was damaged, this is a Kilo class submarine, of which Russia has around 6 of these. So one of them is now out of action. And it's reported that these subs come in at somewhere between $300 and $400 million. So we're talking big expense here for a drone that might have cost Ukraine a couple of $1,000s to produce. And I think one of the interesting things here is that the European Union is currently in the process of trying to provide 1 million drones to Ukraine, which sounds ludicrously large. But when you think about all of the different types of drones that Ukraine is operating, I'm sure these subsea drones will now be pushed right to the top of the list in terms of mass producing as many as possible, because this is a high profile incident. And the more high profile incidents that Ukraine can come up with means that it's causing major problems for Russia, not just from a political perspective, but also from an economic damage point of view. When you're talking about a vessel that's valued at $300 or $400 million being damaged by something that may have cost $3,000 or $4,000, then it starts to put the war into perspective and shows that Ukraine actually can fight back and cause some major problems for Russia. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to make this video really just to highlight the fact that Ukraine have managed to develop some new technology that they're utilizing in their drone warfare against Russia. The war in Ukraine has really been the turning point in terms of actual physical combat. We are seeing a lot more drones being used, particularly by Ukraine, also by Russia as well. They're using drones, but they're also using missiles because they've got tons of missiles and they can afford more missiles, whereas Ukraine is having to be quite smart in terms of how it deploys all of its capital. And drones represent a really cost-effective way of striking back. Also, it enables them to hit targets within Russia, because if you had to have people actually on the ground to do this, firstly, it'd be very dangerous sending operatives into Russia. And secondly, it's more difficult to actually have a targeted strike. Whereas if you've got a drone, which is quite difficult to pick up on radar and also quite difficult to hit, then you can target facilities that might be up to 1,000 miles from the border. And Ukraine is currently working on missiles that could go even further than that, so drones that could go further. So this is a good low-cost way of striking back at Russia. And what Ukraine has been doing up until now is targeting oil and gas infrastructure. That's where it started. It's now widened that scope to be targeting lots of other commercial activities and things like ports, which stop Russia from exporting large quantities of oil. So it's hitting Russia in its pocket. But the development of this underwater drone, which has struck this submarine in a Russian naval base, tells us a couple of things. Firstly, there are no safe havens from Russia's point of view, because if you can get through all of those naval base defense systems and strike a submarine, then you can basically hit anything you like. Secondly, the damage caused to this is going to cause Russia lots of financial problems because they're going to have to pay for all of those repairs. And thirdly, the psychological impact is now very worrying for any Russian operative, because it means that wherever you are, whether you're at land or sea, you could be struck by a drone without any warning whatsoever. And basically, Ukraine is now saying that anything is fair game in terms of targeting those sort of strikes. So I think this really does up the ante from Ukraine's point of view. And from Russia's perspective, this really isn't a good development, because it just can't defend against all of these different attacks. So whilst Russia is pushing forward on the actual fighting on the ground in Ukraine and is trying to take more territory on a daily basis, Ukraine is striking back in a very smart sort of guerrilla tactic way, where you don't know where the next strike is going to hit. And the strike on this Russian submarine is the first time anywhere in the world that this sort of attack has been successful, and really represents a turning point in terms of what might happen on the seas from Russia's perspective over the course of the next 3 to 6 to 12 months. And that's going to be worrying from Russia's point of view, and will give Ukraine a major boost in terms of being able to do something that it hasn't done before. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. That's what I'm trying to do, provoke some thoughts. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Don't forget to buy a ticket in my competition if you'd like to win my beach house, if you'd like to live by the sea, mortgage-free, debt-free, or if you'd just like £250,000 in cash. It's a good way of supporting the channel, so please buy a ticket. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and thank you to everyone that's supported me in other ways, either through YouTube Super Thanks, or Buy Me a Coffee, or Patreon, YouTube membership, or Buy Me a Coffee membership. Really appreciate your support, and here's something to put a smile on your face.